Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marson, and today we're taking a look at Leviticus 15. This is the last chapter of this section in Leviticus that talks about things that are ritually unclean. It describes 4 distinct bodily fluids that mark someone as unclean. 2 affect men, and 2 affect women. 2 are very natural, and the other 2 point to signs of medical problems. It might get a little awkward, but notice how God is not trying to punish us for having sex or being humans. God created sex between a husband and a wife as a method for blessing. It was his command to the first humans in Genesis 1 and 2. But he is also a holy God that we need to have respect and reverence for. We need to acknowledge him as something wholly other than ourselves. And yet somehow he became like us, so that we would become like him. The Lord also spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them, when a man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. This, moreover, shall be his uncleanness in his discharge. It is his uncleanness whether his body allows its discharge to flow, or whether his body obstructs its discharge. Every bed on which the person with the discharge lies becomes unclean, and everything on which he sits becomes unclean. Anyone, moreover, who touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. And whoever sits on the thing on which a man with the discharge has been sitting shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Also, whoever touches the person with the discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Or if a man with the discharge spits on one who is clean, he too shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Every saddle on which the person with the discharge rides becomes unclean. Whoever then touches any of the things which were under him shall be unclean until evening, and he who carries them shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Likewise, whomever the one with discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in water shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. However, an earthenware vessel which the person with the discharge touches shall be broken, and every wooden vessel shall be rinsed with water." The first type of unclean bodily fluid is any male discharge associated with sickness. The word used in Hebrew is literally the word for flow, and is often used to talk about all kinds of things flowing. In the land flowing with milk and honey, that's the word being used. But when it's being used in this context, as a noun, it's talking about unclean bodily fluids that are a result of a disease, sexually transmitted or otherwise. And we see here the infectiousness of uncleanness, how everything they touch, sit on, spit on, any one they come in contact with, they are also marked as unclean and need to wash. Of course, this is all practical sanitary precaution, but like all the other cleanliness practices, it reminds people of the infectiousness of their sin. Now, when the man with the discharge becomes cleansed from his discharge, then he shall count off for himself 7 days for his cleansing. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water and will become clean. Then on the 8th day he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and come before the Lord to the doorway of the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. And the priest shall offer them, one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. So the priest shall make atonement on his behalf before the Lord because of his discharge. And so the man with the discharge is marked unclean, but only for a temporary amount of time, until they recover from whatever ailment they're facing. Then they're able to wash in water, and after 7 days, give a sacrifice to be marked as clean. If you've been paying attention to the last few chapters, you shouldn't be surprised at how that turns out. They could re-enter God's presence and be in community with other people after they had made these offerings. And it's not because being unclean was a sin in and of itself. The sin was to be unclean and to treat God so flippantly as to barge into his presence in your state of human messiness. Now, if a man has a seminal emission, he shall bathe all his body in water and be unclean until evening. As for any garment or any leather on which there is seminal emission, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening. If a man lies with a woman so that there is seminal emission, They shall both bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Now the second type of unclean bodily fluid is seminal emission. Now this bodily fluid is completely natural. It's different than the discharge that was caused by disease. But even today, we feel that aversion, that something that our body naturally produces is gross if it's not in its proper context. Humans are kind of gross creatures. That's why Adam was made out of mud and dust in Genesis 2. We are not inherently holy or inherently godly, which is why interacting with even a natural bodily fluid required washing before entering God's presence. Now, seminal emission being unclean was not God's condemnation of sex, only that even sex should be an act of glorifying God in holiness and purity. Namely, that sex between a husband and a wife is described in Genesis 4. And that's unlike all the corrupt sex that happened in Genesis 5, 9, 16, 19, 30, and 38. Finally, there's another theory proposed by theologians like Mark Rooker as to why seminal emissions were pronounced unclean. It might have been a way to further separate the children of Israel from the rest of the surrounding pagan nations, given the almost sacramental role seminal fluid played in some cultures' cult, orgies, and ceremonies. When a woman has a discharge, if her discharge in her body is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything also on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Whether it be on the bed or on the thing on which she is sitting, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. If a man actually lies with her so that her menstrual impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. So in the same way that seminal emission was pronounced unclean, so was menstrual discharge. And again, it's not because having a period was sinful. It pointed to the inherent unholiness and impurity of humans. Women who were menstruating were unclean for 7 days. That's both a Sabbath cycle and the average length of a woman's menstruation. In the same way, anything that had any sort of exposure to that blood would have also become unclean, as did the men who slept with the women who were menstruating. Leviticus 12 briefly mentioned these instructions when describing the quarantine that new mothers should undergo. And we also remember from Genesis 3 that pain in bearing and conceiving children was a result of the first sin that entered the world that corrupted creation. Ultimately, everything goes back to that initial disobedience, that desire to define good and evil for oneself. And that's why humans are separated from God in the first place. Now, if a woman has a discharge of her blood many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge, she shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity. She is unclean. Any bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her like her bed at menstruation, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean, like her uncleanness at that time. Likewise, whoever touches them shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. The final unclean bodily fluid that's described here mirrors the first, and that's the discharge of a woman that's unrelated to her period. This is a sign of sickness or disease, and it was infectious in the same way, so that anything that it touched or got on also became unclean. And it's hard to read this passage without thinking about Mark 5, the story where Jesus healed a woman who had an issue like this that she was battling for 12 years. When she had the opportunity, she reached out and touched Jesus. Now, under this law, that would have marked Jesus as unclean. But what actually happened was that Jesus was so holy that his holiness was contagious. His holiness passed on to her and healed the woman because of her faith in him. When she becomes clean from her discharge, she shall count off for herself 7 days, and afterwards she will be clean. Then on the 8th day she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and bring them in to the priest, to the doorway of the tent of meeting. The priest shall offer the one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. So So the priest shall make atonement on her behalf before the Lord because of her impure discharge. And so again, after a woman with this type of discharge was healed, she would wait 7 days, be washed, and offer a sacrifice to God. It's the same requirement for the man who had the discharge of disease. And notice too that only these two types of impurity required sacrifices, the two unnatural ones that sprang from disease. The seminal and menstrual discharges only required that the person wash. That's another sign that the Israelites and God understand the distinction between these different types of uncleanness. Thus you shall keep the sons of Israel separated from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in their uncleanness by their defiling my tabernacle that is among them. This is the law for the one with a discharge, and for the man who has a seminal emission, so that he is unclean by it, and for the woman who is ill because of her menstrual impurity, and for the one who has a discharge, whether male or female, or a man who lies with an unclean woman. These verses summarize the whole chapter, but notice the reason God gives as to why the Israelites should honor these standards of cleanliness. It's not because being unclean was sinful. It was sinful to be unclean and enter the tabernacle anyway, thus defiling it. We need to realize that as humans, as mud and dust creatures, we are beneath a holy and pure and righteous God. That's spiritually and physically. We need to have a proper reverence for Him. We need to recognize how holy He actually is. Of course, if just being a normal, natural human is enough to separate us from God, then what hope is there for us to be actually reconciled to our Creator? We look no further than Jesus in Mark 5. He wasn't defiled by the woman with the issue of blood. Instead, His holiness was what was contagious. It rubbed off on her and healed her. God willingly became a mud and dust creature in order to bear our sin and our impurity so that we could become like Him, become like His purity and His holiness. And this will one day be physically true when we're reconciled with Him in our glorified bodies. But it's true today spiritually if we've been reconciled with His Holy Spirit that lives inside of us. And as Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 6, that should be all the more reason to pursue and chase after the holiness of God. Thanks for watching 1189. I hope you have a good day, and God bless.